Mr. Stein, you heard Mr. Harbeck discuss several reasons why, 3 or 4 reasons why he had concerns with or opposed 757. Would you like to run down some of those, his position versus whether he's correct in his opposition?
Well, I think Mr. Harbeck has a slightly different worldview than we do at NIAP. I think what we've all clearly heard from Mr. Harbeck today is that the SIPC fund, instead of perhaps saying how can we help, says how can we not help. I think in Mr. Harbeck's worldview, there's equitability in denying SIPC protection for 75% of the victims, of the innocent victims of a fraud. I think in Mr. Harbeck's worldview, suing 1,000 innocent victims on a clawback claim is an equitable solution. I think in Mr. Harbeck's world, making sure that close to 90% of the recoveries of customer property go to the highest, most wealthy institutional investors is equitable. I think what Mr. Harbeck is missing is the point that there are basically 2 pots from which to provide restitution for victims or benefits to victims. You have the SIPC fund, which has a responsibility. It has a responsibility to pay victims based upon their final account statements or the reasonable expectations of those final account statements. And I would say that that is a very, very core principle underlying the creation of SIPA, and that is step 1. Step 2 is finding and seeking some equitable solution to dealing with the distribution of money from the recovery of customer property. But to focus on customer property, we believe, is a red herring. Second of all, Mr. Harbeck seems to feel that in some way, by paying SIPC benefits in a Ponzi scheme, empowers the fraudster. It legitimizes the fraudster. I would suggest to you that the only thing that legitimizes the fraudster is the failure of the regulatory apparatus to catch the fraudster. And to say that the protection of that giving funds to a customer or a victim of a fraud in a situation like this enables the fraudster is akin to saying a fire truck and a fireman putting out a fire that it was caused by an arsonist in some way legitimizes the arsonist. It's an absolute absurd twisting of the concept. At the core, we are talking about protecting customers. We are protecting small customers, people that are at the core of our financial system. And it doesn't sound to me that Mr. Harbeck has really addressed those core principles, because that, in fact, is what is needed for Madoff victims now.
Thank you. And I have a few more questions, but Mr. Hurt. Thank you, Mr. Stein.
Just following up with Mr. Stein. What I thought I heard Mr. Harbeck talking about, though, was that in his opinion, that SIPC was not designed financially in a fiscal way to be able to address all of the inequities that could possibly occur, and that with respect to the Stanford case, that if you follow the rules as he interprets them, that it was not designed to do that. Now, if Congress or SIPC wants to expand that authority, then suddenly you're going to have to build a different model, and there's going to have to be more capital involved. I think what he said was you'd end up having to have to draw down on the equity line with with the Treasury in order to be able to guarantee that. Mm-hmm. Can you? I mean, I think that's what he was saying. Can you help talk about it in terms of that? Because I think that's what he was saying.
Yeah. Well, let me speak to that briefly, Congressman. I think, first of all, we are in great sympathy with a vast majority of the victims of the Stanford fraud. The vast majority of them had no knowledge that they were investing in something that was not going to be protected, that they were investing through a broker-dealer that was not going to properly manage their funds. They are truly victims. And what I think is important for SIPC to do in a situation like this is to address the situation in a way that says, what can we do to help? And what do we need to do in the future to prevent these sorts of calamities from happening again? And frankly, that's something that requires all parts of the regulatory apparatus to work together on. The fact of the matter is Mr. Harbeck was correct. There were major failures of regulatory oversight that allowed the Stanford fraud to continue. And that is something that we have to pay very, very significant attention to. That said, I think we also have to find a way to think about how we can help the Stanford victims rather than do them further damage.
Another question that I would like to address or have addressed is a question that I asked the previous panel, and that is when you look at the broker-dealers that are paying for this protection for the public, which I think everybody understands and agrees is appropriate, but at some point it seems to me you have to be concerned about how much you're asking those individuals to contribute, because at the end of the day, that comes out of their bottom line, and it makes them either more profitable or less profitable, allows them to stay in business and provide that protection. But it is something that I'm aware of, because as I travel across my district, I hear from people in every line of work who say, you know, these little fees, they sound good when you're talking about them in the committee meeting in Washington, but once they all pile up on us, that they have a devastating effect on our ability to be competitive. And I was wondering if maybe just each of you could just speak to that topic. What is the appropriate level of assessment, and does that assessment take into account the size and relative risk that perhaps each dealer broker exposes the fund to?
Well, I think Mr. Caruso has spoken well to that issue, but the fact that for the better part of the last 20 years, that every member of SIPC has been charged a paltry $150 per year, that ultimately led to the potential trauma that is now being experienced by the SIPC fund, is beyond comprehension. And by the way, the SIPC fund, as it's presently constituted, has more than sufficient assets to pay off the advances to all the Madoff victims, just as a point to be made. But you get to a very important point, and that is, why were the members of SIPC resistant to increasing SIPC fees for the last 20 years when this committee and other committees recommended an increase to the SIPC assessment over the last 20 years? We would have a SIPC fund that would have multiples of billions of dollars, more than capable of paying for the Stanford and the Madoff, and potentially even some of the MF Global situation, had there been a proper assessment on the SIPC members. Now, the second part of this that Mr. Caruso alluded to is the process of underwriting. If you are going to take on a SIPC member who increases by their very practice the level of risk, it's important that we find some method to increase the cost for that individual. A high-risk driver should be charged a higher rate than a low-risk driver. An investment advisor that has custody of their own assets should probably be charged a different rate than one that doesn't. So I think to get to the ultimate part of it, I think we have to find an assessment level that is consistent with the risk, and also begin the process of bringing in the private sector to add and improve the quality, the extent of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.